and welcome everybody to the ATS RCMB ECP seminar group. This is our first seminar of this fiscal year, and it is brought about because of requests from other ECPs that have interest in pursuing careers in industry and transitioning from academia into industry. And so our very warm welcome to our guests, Dr. Jason Rock and Dr. Paul Reyfman. I will go through and introduce them just in a moment. But first, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. The purpose of our seminars are threefold. First of all, we want to establish connection with all of you. We aim to connect with you as early career professionals and with established investigators and also with one another. The second is provide easily accessible forum for discussion of topics that are relevant to early career professionals. And finally, we want to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion through thoughtful choice of speakers, open discussion, and community. And today, again, as I said, our event features two scientists who have successful careers in industry. First, we have Dr. Jason Rock from Genetech and Dr. Paul Reyfman from Merck. We will have Scott formally introduce them shortly. The format of today's session is a moderated interview. I will serve as one of the moderators. My name is Beth Middleton. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Utah with interest in platelet and megakaryocyte biology, and I'll be co-hosting with Scott Denstaedt from the University of Michigan. We've developed a few themes that we'll focus on today. If you think of any questions during the event, the chat box will be open and available throughout. We encourage you all to leave your video on if you would like, but ask that you please mute yourself throughout. Go ahead, Scott.
Thank you, Beth. So as Beth said, I'm Scott Denstaedt. I'm an assistant professor in pulmonary and critical care medicine at the University of Michigan, physician scientist studying acute lung injury. And it is my great pleasure to introduce two incredible researchers who have kindly joined us today. Dr. Rock is a distinguished scientist in immunology and regenerative medicine and research biology at Genetech. After completing his PhD in molecular genetics and developmental biology at the University of Florida, Dr. Rock completed postdoctoral training at Duke University in cell biology. Subsequently, he joined faculty at UCSF as an assistant professor and then moved to Boston University as an associate professor, where he studied how the microenvironment regulates the behavior of epithelial cells and fibroblasts in the lung. And in 2020, Dr. Rock moved his lab to Genentech, where he's continued to develop novel therapies for lung disease. Dr. Reyfman is a senior director of cardiovascular and respiratory late-stage clinical development at Merck. Dr. Reyfman completed his medical degree and residency training at Columbia University. He went on to a clinical fellowship at Northwestern, where he also earned a master's degree in health and biomedical informatics and joined pulmonary faculty there. And in 2021, Dr. Reyfman moved to Merck as the director of cardiovascular and respiratory clinical development.
Thank you both for joining us. My first question, because the organization structure of industry and pharma is unknown to many of us, I'm wondering if Dr. Rock, you could give us sort of an overview of how the different stages which one can develop a career.
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at this and then welcome Dr. Reyfman's comments and edits. So I sit in early discovery research, which operates much like an academic medical center would, where we have basic research ranging from in vitro cell culture models through animal models, as well as what we call reverse translation, which is bringing human samples back into the lab to really do bedside to bench type research. We, at some point, transition the majority of our responsibilities to our colleagues in early clinical development. So those tend to be more clinical positions, which really start thinking about clinical trial design and how we will develop particular assets as drugs in the clinic, including biomarker discovery, biomarker development, and a real clinical development plan for early stage clinical development. So that's usually phase 1 and phase 2. And then there's another soft handoff between early clinical development and late stage clinical development, which really prepares for phase 3 registrational trials, as well as IND filing and FDA approval. And then along with that comes all of the other associated functions that we tend to think of being more administrative, I guess, ranging from HR to scientific communications and legal and other sorts of functions. And so I sit in basic research in GRED research and early development. And yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Great. Oh, anything to add to that? And where you work and how you overlap with these other areas.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me today. I think Jason covered the overview really nicely, that same kind of framework of discovery, early clinical development, sometimes called translational medicine, and late stage clinical development functions very similarly at Merck as well. So I sit in late stage clinical development, and I would say that's less like a basic kind of science research lab and feels more like the kind of clinical research parts of an academic division. So my experience in the pulmonary division at Northwestern, or kind of like an internal medicine department. It's very focused on the science. The interactions are around planning and executing these phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, which are the larger ones focused really on establishing efficacy for an investigational drug.
Great. Can I ask, again, I'll jump back to Dr. Rock. How did you decide to transition from academia to industry?
Yeah, I had considered moving to industry at various points in my career, but at no point did I feel like it was the right time or the right position for me. And so in 2019, I was approached by someone who had recently also themselves moved to Genentech, and they were building out a division in regenerative medicine. And it was really aligned with my scientific vision. And after my first interview, I came away really energized by the breadth and depth of scientific knowledge and expertise that would be available to me were to move to Genentech. And it really felt right. So I wouldn't say that I necessarily set out or decided it was the right time or wanted to move into Genentech or industry for that matter. But in retrospect, I can tell you that I was somewhat motivated by the fact that I felt the more advanced or towards the middle of my career I got in academia, the more I felt restricted with respect to what I could do that was really paid by my grants. I think when you come in as an assistant professor and you have a startup package, you can really explore and do the things that are exciting to you. But in that mid-stage career, I really felt kind of beholden to the preliminary data that I had generated and my ability to execute and demonstrate progress through the traditional metrics of publication, invited seminars and things. And so I really felt myself restricted in a small area. And that's somewhat different in industry, where I think I have general guardrails of things that I'm, we have guidance on what is developable, what sorts of endpoints we want to move the needle on, and which sorts of biology we're interested in. But within that framework, I'm really free to explore and do things that I might not otherwise be able to do in academia. And I'll also just shout out to the other functions with which we interface pretty regularly. Our colleagues in drug discovery, our colleagues in the clinical divisions. They really allow us to do things very easily in industry that might be somewhat difficult. If I want a tool reagent, if I want an antibody that I could use in a mouse experiment and one doesn't exist, I can go talk to my colleagues in antibody engineering and really have that reagent in a matter of weeks, if not days, in some cases. If I need access to human tissue samples, oftentimes we'll have them banked from our ongoing and planned clinical trials. And so access to those sorts of facilities and reagents is really, really exciting for us. I feel like I'm limited now really only by my creativity and what I'm able to vocalize and convince my leadership to let me do.
Wow. I mean, I always thought that there would be a lot of resources that you could access through industry, but that's pretty amazing. Dr. Reyfman, what do you think, since your transition to industry, what do you think have been the greatest opportunities?
Sure. My path to industry, I think, was a little bit different from Jason's, coming through a clinical path, I didn't really start thinking about science seriously until, the second year of my fellowship. And I definitely fell in love with it. And moved into faculty on a research pathway, the kind of classic 80-20 physician scientist track. And I did very much enjoy the scientific aspects of what I was doing. However, I think some of the aspects of the kind of grant funding pathway were not really the best fit for me. I felt like, it really is about kind of promoting yourself as as the PI on first, a K level grant and then on kind of multiple R01 level grants. And that's a big part of kind of succeeding on that pathway. And so I started to look around and explore industry as an option. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that it really was also very much about kind of the science, but without maybe some of that promotion kind of yourself as the investigator aspect that I was seeing on the physician scientist pathway. And then I really would like to echo what Jason said. There's this team aspect to it that really is a very good fit for me, where you're just surrounded by experts in kind of any aspect that you can imagine that's key to executing a clinical trial. And you're encouraged to bring your own expertise to the table, and also learn how to kind of play off the expertise of everyone on your team. So kind of that approach to scientific problem solving in terms of whether it's designing a clinical trial or executing a clinical trial, dealing with some of the challenges that can arise there, and being able to bring my own expertise as a pulmonary critical care physician with a scientific background, but also bring in all the other members of the team. To me, that has been kind of the most gratifying part of being in industry.
Dr. Reyfman, we'll kind of continue with you for a second to follow up on this opportunities and learning about opportunities too. So I assume a number of the participants are here today because they either thought about industry or just interested in learning more about getting involved. And I think one major question is probably, where do you even start? So I'd like to ask you, and then Dr. Rock will have you follow up as well. Where did you start? How did you start learning? And do you have any recommendations for people who are interested?
Yeah, I think I probably did not approach it in the most effective way possible. And I think that's because there's a lot of variability in terms of exposure to this as a career option. And I think there are some places where there are, a lot of kind of former faculty or postdocs who have moved from that institution to industry, and it's not, necessarily discouraged, and they're available for kind of networking. And in that scenario, if that's where you are, I would definitely recommend leveraging that. Talk to as many people as possible. I was in a situation where there was a lot less of that resource available to me. And so I was just, applying through the portals on different companies' websites, a few kind of contacts that I had, talking to them as well. I would not recommend applying through the portal, because you could be a great candidate for that position and your application could just get missed. It's not the most effective way. So I would really recommend, this is where that kind of somewhat painful aspect of networking is really important. And even if it's people that you don't necessarily know very well, ask around. Even if you feel like maybe, I think there's this feeling that if I start talking about this to people around me in my division, that's going to hurt my career if I decide not to do it. I think in most cases, it won't really, and you will be surprised that people will be more receptive to it And, your mentors or other people at your institution may be able to put you in touch with people. And that's really how I would recommend doing it. And then if you do see something on a portal, whether it's, even a third degree connection, if you can kind of tap somebody so that you have contact with someone kind of on the inside, that would make it much more effective to kind of start applying.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Rock, to follow up.
Yeah, I really have nothing to add there. I totally agree that this is where a network becomes really important. Ask around, ask people you know, ask former classmates or co-patriots in postdoc. I think that's probably the best way to learn. You can learn a lot about a company on their kind of pipeline and mission website. Do you want to go to a biotech, a startup that maybe has one asset or one area of interest, as opposed to a big pharma that might specialize in a couple of areas? So there's a little bit of homework that someone could do on their own, just to explore various options. But really beyond that, it's best to talk to somebody on the inside to really see what's the secret sauce of the company and what's the daily life like there. And I think there was a reference to a third degree connection, maybe intentionally or not, to LinkedIn. I mean, I think you can learn a lot about LinkedIn, just expanding your LinkedIn network. People post jobs when they're hiring. People talk about exciting opportunities, internships, and things like that. So definitely, I would leverage platforms like LinkedIn.
Is there anything in particular? It seems that a lot of training, postdoctoral training, tends to be fairly focused in a particular niche. Is there any particular way that ECPs should market themselves or put things on their CV to make them more be a better fit for a position in industry?
I can take a stab at that first, and then I'll let Paul respond. To me, I think it doesn't behoove anyone to kind of fudge or twist or manipulate their CV. I think in industry, much like academia and government for that matter, we value good scientists, right? So highlight all of the good science that you've done, the productivity that you've had, and the network that you've established. Really where you've driven decisions or driven the science and made an impact. That's what we would want to see as recruiters or hiring managers on a CV. There are bespoke training opportunities. UCSF and Stanford co-lead a really renowned course in drug discovery and drug development. We sponsor internships and rotations over the summer that would obviously look good on someone's CV who wanted to go to industry within Genentech or otherwise. So if you have that sort of experience, definitely put it on your CV. But at the same time, I think that just highlighting the science and the impact that you've made is your best bet.
Great. Anything to add, Paul?
Yeah, I think that this is a fairly common question when I've talked to people thinking about moving into industry. There is nervousness and maybe insecurity about not having that kind of slick one-page resume that people in the corporate world want to see. I would say that is completely unnecessary. I think that it's true that getting the first job you're getting in industry is going to be typically the hardest one. But it's also true that many, many, many people are hired out of academia into industry. And what they're looking for is the same thing that any other academic institution is looking for. They know you don't have industry experience, but they also know that you've developed kind of a deep expertise and a set of skills. So at that stage, I think that your just straight academic CV that highlights everything you've done is totally acceptable and very welcome and effective. And I don't think you need to worry too much about kind of tailoring it a certain way for industry as opposed to academia.
Great tips. I'm sure many people will appreciate that input. I want to transition a little bit. You spoke and introduced the concept of teams and working a bunch with teams. Could you give us a little more detail on what are your sort of immediate teams, the sizes, the different roles there are, and then in a sort of a larger scale, how you're interacting with each other?
I can start off. So one corporate term that you might hear a lot when you're talking about industry is this idea of a kind of matrix organization. And what that just means is that you have you exist in kind of a team that is people who do sort of the same exact kind of thing as you. So I'm a clinical director. I'm in a late stage development group. And, I have people that are kind of working on other studies that I'm not working on, and, managers, and it goes up, to different higher levels of management through kind of that area. But when I'm working on an individual study, there would be at most a couple, often no other kind of clinical director, no other person directly in that group. So now, rather than thinking about kind of vertically who I'm sort of working with, it's kind of horizontally. So these are the other people that do other things that are on the study with me, helping to make the study work. So that could be somebody like the study manager, who's a critical person managing the operational aspects of the study, leading a lot of our kind of study team meetings, and also being kind of the face of the company headquarters to the folks of the company that are more focused on kind of the individual study sites, for example. There are, biostatistical experts on the team. There are clinical scientists who work on kind of aspects of the protocol and making sure the protocol is done correctly and people aren't deviating from the protocol, or at least that's documented and that kind of thing. So I think often on an individual project, so that's a study, it could be a program, so overseeing all the studies. Often there's kind of a core team that's somewhere in the range of like 5 to 10 people. And I think that that's in part deliberate because it's hard to get anything really done if you have meetings with, 20, 30, 40 people. But at the same time, there also is usually a larger team beyond that, and everybody has their own kind of functional group meetings as well. But I would say often the teams that you're working with really very closely on an individual project are somewhere in that 5 to 10 person range, with kind of and another ring around that can be, as many as 20, 30 kind of more people.
Dr. Rock, can you comment on sort of the earlier development stage, what your team structure looks like and how you're interacting with the later stage clinical?
Yeah, happy to do that. So I have a lab myself. I run a lab that has 3 scientists, 3 bench scientists, and 5 postdocs. The scientists are really independent contributors, so they are, developing their own ideas and hypotheses and nominating targets, and then generating the preliminary data to support advancement of those targets into what we call the pipeline, which is the path towards drug discovery. So there are 3 scientists in my group and 5 postdocs. I sit within a department of immunology and regeneration that has, I would say, somewhere on the order of 15 or 20 other lab heads who have similarly sized labs. And so then there are 8 therapeutic areas, or 8 departments within Genetech. So you can imagine then the scale of the research organization within GRED. At any given time, there are about 200 postdocs on our South San Francisco campus, just for size and scale. So that's kind of how we operate in the lab-based system. But as Paul alluded to, we wear many different hats. So as these pipeline projects mature, 1 or 2 folks from the lab side will stay on those projects as what we call bio leads, or research biology leads. And we'll start getting assigned other functions. Somebody probably like preclinical safety will come on the team. Somebody from antibody engineering or medchem will come on. We'll get folks from DMPK. We'll get folks from legal, who will start looking into all of the different aspects of how we'll make that into a drug and how we'll protect our IP and our ability eventually to profit from it. And so on those teams, you'll have on the order of 15 or 20 people, and that's where the really matrixed environment comes in. So you have many different functions, none of whom actually have any direct managerial responsibility over anybody else on the team. So that gets to be a little bit fun, as you might imagine, where everybody has somewhat competing interests, but we're all working towards the same goal. And then there are other units of function. So I lead our efforts in research around respiratory disease, namely COPD, asthma, and fibrotic disease. And so in that respect, there's a huge kind of what we call dotted line structure where I oversee a portion of the efforts of a number of people who are all working towards a common goal of developing novel therapeutics in the respiratory space. And I would say in that context, there's probably about 100 of us on the core team in respiratory research. And so on any given day, you might wear, I could be in a one-on-one with one of my postdocs and then leading a pretty high-level discussion around an advanced preclinical program that we have, which I find that to be really exciting. I don't feel like I ever do the same thing twice, which is really fun.
So obviously there's a very different structure to the academic environment in industry. And Dr. Rock, one of the things you mentioned that was a little bit surprising to me was the position of a postdoc position in industry. And others might be familiar with that, but I'm less familiar with that. Can you talk to me more about what a postdoc position looks like in your lab, how one goes about achieving one of those, and maybe how that differs from postdoc positions in academia?
Sure. I don't think the postdoc program is unique to Genentech. I think we were one of the first to have a postdoc program, but I know several other pharmas do. I don't know if Merck has one, but Amgen certainly does down the street. AbbVie has one. We have, again, about 200 postdocs on campus at any given time. So there's a nice community. They have a postdoc offsite annually, a postdoc works in progress. I think the day-to-day responsibilities and roles of a postdoc in industry are no different, really, than they would be in academia. We encourage, if not restrict, our postdocs to avoid any projects that are directly related to the pipeline because there are obvious issues with being able to publish their work and IP rights and the like. So we really encourage our postdocs to do what we call academic-like projects, which, might be contributing to a cell-based atlas or running a high-throughput screen or generating proof of concept for a particular gene or target in a cell type or animal model. And so really, unlike, not dissimilar to any academic postdoc, I would say, in terms of the scope of their research endeavors. I guess the main difference are you're constantly exposed to drug discovery. And I think for many postdocs, that is somewhat exciting that you see how we turn the crank of drug discovery and drug development. So that exposure can be very helpful for postdocs when they do go on the job market, especially if they're interested in industry careers. And while postdoc projects typically get a little bit less priority than do pipeline projects for obvious reasons, they do get some access to these other functions, right? So a postdoc in Genentech might have access to a tool antibody that might be very hard to come by for a postdoc in academia. So you do have access to resources that I think might be somewhat unique to industry postdoc positions. How do you get one? So they will be listed at least for Genentech, they'll be listed on the website under our careers available at Genentech. Oftentimes people will post them on places like LinkedIn. Occasionally we'll post them in the normal Science, Nature, Cell type magazines as available positions. But again, it never hurts to reach out and just ask somebody if they know any postdoc positions that are available or soon to come available. Sorry.
One follow-up question is, if you do a postdoc in industry, do many of those trainees stay in industry, or is it possible to go to academia?
Yeah, the guidance that we give postdocs when they apply to the program is that this is not a backdoor into an industry position either in Genentech or elsewhere. We really don't train you to be an industry type scientist. We train you to be a good scientist, much like you would be trained in academia. That said, many oftentimes do find positions either within Genentech or in nearby industry settings. So I would say that it's probably about 50-50.
Okay.
I should also say we have a an award that's given once a year that's very similar to a K-99. So one postdoc each year from the Genentech program who's finishing up gets a transition award that I think is pretty nice. It allows them to stay on for an extra year to generate preliminary data at Genentech and then funds their lab for 2 to 3 years in academia once they find a job. So I think the expectation is really to enable people to go back to academia, but certainly there are exceptions.
Yeah, that's great. Great information. Paul, just wondering about the clinical side with your MD background. Are there opportunities for clinical trainees, fellows, et cetera? Because all of those tend to be done through academic institutions. Are there opportunities for them to collaborate or get involved at all with industry during their training?
I think in terms of collaboration, there are industry-sponsored studies, and those would typically be the way that you would initiate one of those would be to talk to kind of a medical science liaison, MSL, for a company that produces the relevant kind of product for a study that you're interested in, and they would guide you through kind of that application process. I think that is more of a funding opportunity than an opportunity to learn about industry and move into industry. We don't really have the equivalent of, we do have postdocs in the kind of discovery space at Merck, but there isn't an equivalent of something like that in late stage development where you could kind of learn about it or work there. The one thing I have heard of that we don't have at Merck, but some other companies do have, is a kind of rotational position where you do something like a year or 2 years and you do different rotations at within different functions or kind of different areas within the company. So it could be, clinical development, regulatory affairs, medical affairs, safety, that kind of thing. And then I think at the end, you are well positioned potentially to stay at the company if there is a spot available, but it's not a guarantee. So there's a risk trade-off there where if you're interested in something specific like clinical development, I would probably say it's better to look for a job in that because that's more likely to translate into kind of longer term, more stable employment than that kind of rotational position. But I think the rotational position also would offer an excellent opportunity to learn a lot about different aspects of how drug development works.
There's a question that popped up in the chat. Are there limitations on people that are on a visa, particularly a J1 visa?
I do not know the aspects of visa sponsorship from different companies. I would imagine that larger companies would be more likely to be able to do something like that, and smaller biotech companies would be less capable of doing that.
Yeah, I would just say the recruiter will get in touch with you. I know on many cases we have sponsored folks for visas, we sponsor folks for green cards. So I know it is possible. We have an entire immigration service who contracts with us. So get in touch with the recruiter. I wouldn't let that hold you back from exploring an opportunity. And they can let you know whether there's a way to make it happen.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So that's actually a good transition. So clearly there's some differences from academia because our ability to support visas in academia is probably less than that. And what, elaborating on that a little bit further, I'd like to talk a little bit about resources, maybe true conceptions or misconceptions about resources in industry. I think most people assume that the resources are much more broad, and perhaps there are some limitations in terms of how you can use those resources creatively. So Dr. Rock, why don't you go ahead and talk to us more about the resources you have available and maybe how that differs from what you had previously.
Sure. So we get a departmental budget. We have an internal budget that we use for consumables and capital expense every year, and we have a separate budget that is for what we call outside services. So that can be anything from a research contract that we have with an academic university, or if we want to run a mouse experiment or other animal model experiment through a CRO, a contract research organization, that all comes out of our outside services budget. So my vice president of the entire department gets an allocation each year, and then it's up to her how she wants to divvy that up. But the typical way that we do it is we put on a spreadsheet at the end of the year and at the middle of the year what we want to spend a lot of money on, and then she prioritizes them and funds them accordingly. I will say that everything I've ever proposed since being at Genentech has been endorsed. I don't know whether that's because resources are limitless, or that they've just been in the fundable range of suggestions for outside services spend. So small equipment, 10x reagents and things like that are generally not an issue, but they will be approved by your manager, your line manager. So anybody in my lab who orders something, I will get pinged when it's over 5,000, I think. And so obviously there's some trust that we don't abuse that system. And there are checks and balances.
Paul, how about your resources?
Yeah, that was really interesting to hear about. It's actually quite different on the late stage side. Something that I was pretty surprised to hear about when I was learning about industry and thinking back, I think it still is kind of surprising how it plays out, is that you still have to kind of apply to leadership essentially, and it goes in late stage because these are such massive, expensive trials. It goes higher than just our functional area vice president. It basically goes up to kind of like the senior vice president and even higher levels of management. In order to get approval for kind of different aspects of a study, you actually have a contract. You go to governance with a proposal. You need to have a really strong rationale and your underlying assumptions laid out, and potentially alternatives that you considered and why you maybe aren't recommending that those be the ones that are implemented. And you come out of that with a contract, talking about budget, timelines, and then if you're moving forward with the trial and you're not fulfilling what's in the contract, you have to go back and update the contract. It's kind of this interesting mix of very much something in the corporate world, but with a very scientific mindset. So, your power calculations, what are the assumptions that went into that? What are the assumptions that went into, how fast you think a trial is going to enroll? All of those things, the more clearly you're able to kind of justify the assumptions that went into that, the better positioned you are in kind of making the case with regard to your budget. And I think if you open the news, or kind of look at something like Fierce Biotech or Fierce Pharma, an industry blog, you'll see that companies sometimes place higher priority on certain assets in development and sometimes make the decision, not to develop further or to close development for something in an indication. So there definitely are decisions being made in industry that can impact what you're working on, in terms of the company making the decision not to fund that any further or kind of deciding to fund it. So I actually have enjoyed a lot learning about this, and again, I think kind of the scientific aspect of it is something that I find very gratifying, but it is, I think, one difference from how things are kind of in academia.
It's really interesting. I mean, in one hand, it sounds like there can be access to seemingly limitless resources, but they have to be very well justified.
I think we should level set with respect to the scales, though. I mean, clinical trials, a phase 3 clinical trial is orders of magnitude more expensive than the biggest mouse experiment you could imagine, right? So certainly if I want to start spending in the triple, large scale, then I'm going in front of the entire research review committee or the research leadership team to negotiate that contract. But day-to-day lab expenses. What your academic lab spends off an RO1 or 2 or 3 doesn't need to be vetted by the director of Genetech.
And I just wanted to add to that. I think the thing to remember is that these companies attract extremely talented people. There's so much exciting science going on. And ultimately, while it may feel like the resources are limitless, they definitely are not. They are limited. So they have to make decisions about kind of what to prioritize in terms of, what general areas, more oncology, more general and specialty medicine, or specific assets, specific mechanisms. Ultimately, there's a trade-off that has to be made. Everyone that they decide to support, there's going to be one probably that is not supported. And that's just how it has to be.
Yeah, I guess on any scale, time and budgets can be a limitation. I want to ask, what kind of pressures do you face with a career in industry?
I can start that off. One that the first one that comes to mind for me is that, I serve as a clinical director on trials, and that role sometimes is used interchangeably with medical monitor. There's some distinction there. We don't need to get into that, except to say that in my role, investigators at individual sites, reach out to me with medical questions. So as somebody in that role, you're very much providing some kind of medical input on real patients. And so in that sense, there are a lot of the same pressures. You can be thinking about a case just the same way as you would as a physician, a patient that you saw in clinic or in the ICU, and you're thinking about them, and that adds kind of stress. I think if you're this far in kind of your career and still in it, you probably get some kind of gratification out of that as well, but certainly there's some stress there. I think that there are, beyond that, I would say the other biggest source of stress is just that things can be cyclical. There can be, slightly less busy times, or there can be really busy times where there's kind of a crunch period for something. You could have two things that you're working on, have a crunch period at the same time. And yeah, that can be really stressful. I think overall, it's more the stress is a little bit of that sort is a little bit more evenly spread out than kind of the, every couple year grant cycle of, a month or two of just furiously writing a massive 100-something page document all by yourself. But that stress is there as well.
Dr. Rock, how about on the development side?
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, the stress tends to be more of a slow and steady burn. There's always a little bit of corporate pressure and oversight, as opposed to a cyclical grant deadline pressure. Certainly, we have governance check-ins. If I've proposed an initiative or I have a strategy, I'm working on a disease area strategy refresh at the moment. That turns into a very large governance meeting, which is quite stressful. So that is, one of these cyclical pressures. But I would say just day-to-day pressure is a little bit more intense maybe than it was in academia. And I guess scientifically, there's a little bit of a different pressure, because while we do value publication, and it is one of the metrics against which we are evaluated, you're really trying to make a good drug at the end of the day. And so, convincing reviewers is a little bit less important. Your personal reputation is not so important, but really your skill and ability to develop good and effective and safe drugs is what matters in this space. And so you really want to throw the best product possible over the line to early clinical development. And so that is a unique pressure, which requires a completely different skill set, but I think ultimately can be quite rewarding.
That really speaks to me. Yeah, I think as you were saying that, I'm thinking about, you're designing a clinical trial and the endpoints, how you're measuring the endpoints, not just the primary endpoint, but secondary endpoints, how you're measuring safety. All of these things could ultimately impact whether the drug gets approved, but also how it gets approved, how kind of payers view it, and therefore the ability of patients to be able to get access to it. And I do actually, as you're saying that, I was thinking I do feel pressure related to those decisions because they have an impact that might not be realized, for years, but is very real.
Following up on that, how stable are careers when somebody transitions into industry?
I mean, I guess the truth of the matter is I could wake up to an email tomorrow or, come to work and my badge not work. And that is just the reality of it. So if you're looking for stability, um, uh, it might not be the right career path for you. Having said that, we do have metrics with which we can assess productivity and success. And I think as long as you are on the right track, you are probably safe. It's true that there are, strategic decisions and indications get prioritized and deprioritized, or teams may be prioritized or deprioritized. And so that could come with it some organizational changes. Again, Fierce Biotech will tell you that happens pretty regularly in our space, and it's just a reality. Having said all of that, I think once you've made the transition to industry and demonstrated your ability to function in this space, it's pretty, I wouldn't say easy, but you should be able to land on your feet and find another position. And so I think that's one thing that is maybe a little bit different from academia. Kind of once you're in this space, it's a pretty small world. You know somebody who knows somebody who's recruiting, and I think you tend to land on your feet. But I personally feel pretty safe. I think my team feels safe. And, it's not like people are running around thinking like, is my email going to work tomorrow? That's not really how we operate. And, I think any business who operated that way would probably lose their employees pretty quickly.
Fair.
I would agree with that. I think that there are no jobs as stable as kind of academia once you're on faculty, essentially. That is a very, very, very stable job. So I think if that's your basis of comparison, then it's more unstable. The one thing I would say is that small biotech is more unstable for certain. There's also the opportunity to really, really meaningfully contribute to something, that could be a huge success, where having that degree of leverage that, early into industry is harder to do in large pharma. But I think broadly speaking, otherwise I would echo what Jason said, that, I feel pretty stable, but obviously the same thing could happen to me. I could come in and not have a job tomorrow, and it's not as stable as academia.
But it sounds like the opportunities are there, even in the event that something unplanned happened.
Yeah.
I want to transition to work-life balance. How have you noted that your, time at work, time dedicated to travel, et cetera, and your life outside of work has changed since you've left academia? I'll start with you, Paul.
I've been very happy with the change. I'm married to another physician, so I think between my wife and I, two physician schedules with weekends, that wasn't a good matchup. I think having more predictable kind of 9 to 5 with some answering emails, looking for kind of important emails outside of those hours, and having periods of time where obviously you're working more than that, it is a much better fit for me personally. So I've been very happy with it, I would say, overall. In terms of weekends, the biggest thing that I have to do on weekends is when there's travel for some kind of meeting. Then you're basically working on the weekend and not even coming home at the end of the day. And I think the amount of travel can vary depending on kind of the role, and is certainly something that I would say to discuss and understand before you take any kind of role. But otherwise, maybe occasionally having to do some work for kind of a project with a deadline coming up on the weekend, but more free weekends, generally speaking, than before moving over.
Jason?
Yeah, I would agree. I think I'm certainly traveling now more than I did. We have research orgs in several places around the world, and so site visits are definitely a thing. We continue to participate in conferences. With respect to work-life balance, I really, we are a business. It's a very corporate environment, and a lot of the non-scientific roles tend to work sort of 9 to 5 days. And so there's certainly a rhythm to that happens across the campus. Having said that, you're kind of always on. And I think the people who tend to do really well in our space work much longer hours than that. They do tend to work into the evening, maybe after dinner, pick up the laptop or the cell phone and respond to emails. And again, when we're working on these governance type check-ins, certainly there's a concentrated period of effort. But I do feel overall that work-life balance is generally better in industry than it was in academia. And I feel like despite this kind of smoldering constant pressure, there's a little bit less of this feeling that the whole world sits on your shoulders. When I was running a lab in academia, you kind of feel like if I don't get this grant, I've got all of these students and postdocs and technicians whose lives are going to be impacted. And I think here, you kind of don't bear that cross to say.
Oh, that would be nice not to have that kind of pressure. We are running out of time here. We've got about 4 minutes left. I want to throw out one more question to you two, and thank you so much for all of your time. But is there any advice that you would give to our ECPs about looking at opportunities in industry or making the leap?
I can start. I would say do it even if you don't think you want to move into industry. I don't think I think we need to do a better job of understanding each other. If there shouldn't be this barrier of kind of information flow between academia and industry. I think it will be useful to you to learn more about it, even if you never move over. And people in industry are really nice, so you'll enjoy talking to whoever you reach out to. So I would say start that networking now, even if it's not kind of with some sort of burning goal of moving out of academia and industry. That would be the advice that I would give for sure.
Yeah, I echo that. Just stay curious, I would say. Nobody's pressuring you to make a decision either way, but I think just remain open to possibilities, and whether that's in academia or industry. And I would say, regardless of your next career step, you want to find the right environment that has a similar scientific mission and vision, and something that aligns with your idea of a good work-life balance and cultural environment. So I would just explore that regardless of the position in academia or industry, because at the end of the day, that's the sort of thing that's going to matter to you.
Follow-up question to that. So if people are interested in developing a network, where's the best place to get involved and meet people who are involved in industry?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's probably someone someone you've worked with, someone your boss has worked with, or a third degree connection. I think conferences are also a really great place to meet folks. We go to conferences, we sit there in the audience, we go to the happy hours, right? So just find folks that you can talk to and build a relationship. They might not be the person at the company you want to hear about or know about, but they probably know somebody who they could put you in touch with. And I would say just kind of chip away in that respect, and building a network is probably the best thing you can do.
I think that's great advice. Conferences in particular. I mean, you can look up trials for drugs and diseases that you're interested in. You can go and look at the posters being presented for those trials. Often they can be pretty high impact, actually, trials that are just presented in the poster hall. And even if the main presenter is somebody from academia, if you stand around the poster long enough, you're going to see lots of people that worked on that trial from the company coming by, and you can take an opportunity to talk with them. But yeah, your network, even kind of LinkedIn, as long as you have some kind of tenuous connection, you can try to reach out to people.
Maybe we can make a plug for people going to the ATS 2025 in person.
Definitely.
Okay. One final question, if you guys have a moment, just a question, are there opportunities for career progression and advancement in industry?
Absolutely. The question was about a scientist to a lab head. That can happen. That's another good point. When you're interviewing during the recruitment process, you definitely want to read about the position, ask these questions, because there are different tracks. And the track that you come in on will really dictate the default career trajectory. That's not to say that you can't change tracks once you're in an institution, but generally the track that you come in on is the track that you'll progress on. And so you want to make sure that you have some clarity around the position that you're applying for. But certainly you can progress within a track or jump tracks.
Great. Well, thank you so much for both of you for all of your time. Thank you to the audience for attending and asking good questions. We hope that we'll see you in person at the conference, and have a wonderful holiday coming up, Thanksgiving and Christmas season. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.